We are indeed at a transformative moment in American politics. And the reason we were able to predict this is because we examined American history, examined what has happened in the past, and in this instance at least, the past is prologue. It does tell us, it gives us an idea of what to expect in the future in the United States. Traditionally, or political science tells us, history tells us, that America has gone through periods or cycles of electoral change and stability. The overall picture is really one of 4 decades of relative stability in American politics, American elections. Normally what happens in these 4 decades is that one party tends to dominate the political process and wins, historically, 3/4 of the elections that are contested during that 36 to 40 years. So if you look at the PowerPoint graph up there, what you see is that from 1828 to 1856, we had, this was after the establishment of more or less direct democracy of the American political party system, a competitive political party system. The Democratic Party dominated 75% of the elections. Between 1860 and 1892, it was the Republicans' turn after Abraham Lincoln had been elected, and they won 78%. Normally, these things produce a new majority party, but in 1896, the Republican dominance continued for another 36 to 40 years, but it was a different kind of Republican Party, a different cluster of policies, a different set of voting coalitions. So even though it was the same label, it was really a different set of circumstances. In 1938, FDR ushered in another period where, again, uncannily, 78% of the elections contested between 1932 and 1964, the Democratic Party won. And then in 1968, it became the Republicans' turn again, and it was 70% of the elections since 1968, between 68 and 2004, the Republicans have won. We leave a question mark for what's going to happen between 2008 and 2048. We know there's likely to be another one of these things in 2048, when maybe a lot of us aren't going to be around to observe it, but this will again happen. I don't know who the majority party will be. We expected that the Democrats have the great advantage at this point, but there are circumstances in which it could go the other way. But we do know it is going to happen because it has happened. So what we see is then 4 decades of national electoral dominance by one party, which ends in a very brief but decisive realignment. We centered these realignments on specific years, 1860, as Pete mentioned, 1932, 1968. They may take place over the period of an election or two around that, but compared to the longer period of 4 decades where one party is dominant and where one party tends to rule the roost, the changes occur in a very short period of time, an election or two. During that period, what happens once these realignments occur is that there is minimal change in party identification. The electorate pretty much looks the same during the entire period. From the 1930s to the late 1960s, the Democrats had about 50% of the people who identified with the party said they were Democrats, about a third said they were Republican, the rest were independent. Since that time, it's been much more evenly divided, as you know, but it's been about a roughly 50-50 split, with the Republicans maybe having at times a slight advantage and the Democrats other times an advantage. Stability in public policy. Things pretty much, you have a constellation of issues that are dealt with, and public policy remains fairly stable during that period of time. And then suddenly the big shift occurs. Realignments, therefore, are predictable events, even if they somehow surprise what the pundits, a conventional wisdom of the day. As Morley mentioned, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on political realignments, actually right up the road in College Park at the University of Maryland. And this was in the early 1970s. Everybody was surprised that somehow what had existed since the New Deal had changed. Almost everybody was surprised. Kevin Phillips predicted an emerging Republican majority, but most people felt that the Democrats were the natural majority party in America, that it would be activist, interventionist government. That all changed. There are 2 clear causes, 2 reasons why these realignments occur. One of them is the coming of age of a new, large, dynamic generation. And we will talk about what those generations are in just a moment. But that's the first primary cause. A new, large generation comes into the electorate. It is large enough and dynamic enough to turn things around, to essentially start winning elections for its ideals, its beliefs, its way of wanting to govern. And secondly, the emergence of a new communication technology. Once these occur, again, you see clear results, clear outcomes in terms of electoral results, that it lasts for that 35, 36, 40 years. Voting behavior remains stable during that period of time, and public policy also remains stable. So the picture is sharp realignment, era of stability, sharp realignment, era of stability, produced by the large dynamic generation and the emergence of the new communication technology. This year's extreme political makeover, or realignment, is predictable because we know exactly where we are in the movement of the four American generational archetypes that Peter referred to. It was a theory developed by the late Bill Strauss, Neil Howe. Morley and I read their first book, Generations, in 1987, and then their second book 4 years later, The Fourth Turning, looked at it and said, these guys really are brilliant. What we want to do is apply what they have said to the society as a whole, to our favorite area, to our area of concern, politics, and to see if we can back this up, if in fact they are right, with survey research data, and we were able to do that. So let's look at these generations real briefly. The first generational type is what they refer to as an adaptive generation. The most recent version of this, because these generations, again, recur in cycles over periods of approximately 80 years throughout American history, is the silent generation. This generational type was born between 1925 and 1945. And if you know anything about American history, and I'm sure you all do, there were some big events taking place during that period. It was smack in the middle of the Depression. World War II was going on, so the country was really faced with situations of danger. And as a result, this is a relatively small generation. People deferred having children for a while, and when they had children, they had them later, they had fewer children, and they raised their children. This is the key here. It's how these generations are reared by their parents in an overprotected manner. They were smothered as children. The world was scary, and they wanted, and the parents of the silent generation wanted to protect their children. As a result, the generation tended to become risk averse. They tended to be very conformist because their parents channeled them in that direction, and they tended to be inclined toward compromise as adults. And they are, in fact, what people might refer to as a tweener generation. They're between two great, powerful generations. On the one hand, the GI generation, the generation that won World War II, conquered the Depression, and the baby boomer generation, on the other hand, the great causes. So they were too young for one, too old for the other. Unless John McCain is elected president this year, no silent will ever be elected president of the United States. This generation has reached that point because it tends to be a retiring generation. No silent generation will has ever been elected president of the United States. The next generational type was what we refer to as the idealist generation. This is baby boomers. They were born in the United States from 1946 through about 1964. So the GIs had come home from the war. They were positive. They were confident. They now wanted children. Everybody was very upbeat, very positive. We have tried to illustrate this by looking at some of the situation comedies, TV situation comedies of the era, and it really illustrates how this generation and all other generations have been reared and what became of all of this as they aged into adults. So kind of typically was the 1950 sitcom Leave It to Beaver. The children were indulged. Yeah, there were rules. They were that Ward Cleaver kind of impressed on his children. But, there was a sort of a boys will be boys sense about this. And Ward would always talk about his son Beaver whenever Beaver got into a misadventure. Well, I did this when I was a kid and everything turned out okay. So they were kind of indulged. They were allowed to explore, and there wasn't a lot of restrictions on them. The end result was Archie Bunker and his family. And so you had rebellion. You had all of the beliefs that Archie had being challenged by his son-in-law Mike, by his daughter Gloria, and eventually even by his wife Edith. And so there was open, outright rebellion. We coined a phrase at that point, the generation gap, to illustrate that sort of thing. The next generational type, we in Strauss-Howe refer to as a recessive generation. This is Generation X. Again, a small generation. The baby boomers, the remaining silent, were hesitant to have children. Children sort of got in the way of the kind of ideals, the kind of lives they wanted to lead. And as a result, the children tended to be unprotected. They tended to be frequently criticized. If you look at kind of the pop culture of that era, the typical family that you saw on television was the family of married with children, where the adults were going off, they were kind of ineffectual in any case, going off and following their own direction, and the kids just were kind of left to try to fend for themselves. Another example might be Beavis and Butthead. That was the view of children at that particular point of time in American pop culture. Many of the sitcoms never had children. They were shows like Cheers and Mary Tyler Moore, where you went for entire seasons and never saw a child, never saw anybody being married. It was just these people trying to live their own lives. And so the result of this was, first of all, children who were alienated from their parents' attitudes, from their parents' values. But because they had to fend for themselves, they tended to be a generation of risk takers. They were entrepreneurial. They had to figure out how to do it on their own. They were pragmatic adults. And you can see that in the cast of Friends. Never quite get together. It takes them a while to do things. Never seem to be real good with holding a job for a long period of time. But somehow they always make things happen. They always manage to accomplish what they need to accomplish in the end. Not surprisingly, given that kind of background, this generation tended to endorse the entrepreneurial attitudes espoused by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And finally, the fourth type of generation, which we refer to as a civic generation. In reaction to the way the Gen Xers were reared, when the Gen Xers became adults, became parents, they protected their children. They revered their children. They were definitely wanted. You can think of some of the movies of that particular era. 3 Men and a Baby. Dissolute baby boomers now have children, and it completely transformed their lives. So the children are protected, they're revered, and you see, as a result, they become group-oriented, problem-solving. They build institutions. They negotiate with their parents. And again, typical sitcoms, family ties. The two oldest children, Alex P. Keaton, Michael J. Fox, is in fact one of those Reagan Republicans. He rebels against his parents who are reformed liberal baby boomer Democrats, and he becomes a Republican. His oldest sister Mallory, is really more interested in being a consumer at the mall, and that's what she spends most of her life doing, buying fashion. But even then, she becomes entrepreneurial. She figures out how to do it, and she becomes a pretty good fashion designer. The two younger children in this family are, in fact, the two baby boomers. Two millennials, thank you. And Alex P. Keaton spends most of his life trying to convert them to Reagan Republicanism. They're nice, they don't fight with their brother, but they don't go along with his political point of view either. Another great example, of course, is the Huxtables in the Bill Cosby Show. Bill and Felicia Rashad spend most of their lives trying to figure out how they are going to get rid of the kids so they can go after their own lives, but they really don't mean it, and it's just simply a matter of setting up rules, but they negotiate the rules with their kids, and they raise their children as the way millennials tended to be raised throughout the remainder of the 1980s into the 1990s. These two powerful dynamic types of generations, the civic generations, the GI generation of the 1930s, which is the lineal ancestor of the millennials of the current era, and the idealists, or the baby boomers in this current cycle, have led all of America's previous realignments. So in 1828, when Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams battled it out for the presidency, it began not only a democratic era, but an idealist era. In 1860, when it was Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, that began a civic era. 1896, again, even though the Republican Party tended to be dominant, it was a different Republican Party, different goals, different voting coalitions. And so when William McKinley defeated Bryan, it became an idealist era. In 1932, Hoover loses to Roosevelt. It establishes a democratic civic era. And finally, in the late 1960s, as Richard Nixon changes voting coalitions, changes political patterns, the Republicans become the dominant party. So the 1968 realignment came about as a result of the emergence of an idealist generation, the baby boomer generation. Idealist generations are distinguished by their willingness, their goal of attempting to implement their own personal morality and their own causes through the political process. They are people with high value standards, beliefs, personal morality, and they try to use the political process to make everybody else think about the same way. The normal occurrence in an idealist era, in an era brought about by an idealist realignment, is gridlock and division. The generation, an idealist generation, usually is highly divided along ideological lines. We normally think of the baby boomers, at least by the early examples, as a liberal, somehow liberal radical generation because of the feminist movement, because of the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And yes, that part was true. But there were as many or more conservatives within the baby boomer movement, or baby boomer generation, as there were liberals. On college campuses in the late 1960s, in fact, there were twice as many members of the Young Americans for Freedom as the SDS. You think about the great iconic picture of the young woman at Kent State kneeling over the body of her classmate who has been killed by the National Guard, and we think about that part of the baby boomer generation. We don't think that the people who actually pulled the trigger were also baby boomers as well. The notion of a gender gap, the idea of a gender gap, liberal Democratic women voting against conservative Republican men started with this generation and indeed continues to this very day. Younger generations are not nearly as divided along gender lines as are the baby boomers 40 years later. So it is a generation that is divided, and as a result of these strong, firm moral beliefs, the two sides have difficulty getting together, and we see an era of 4 decades of political gridlock. And we also see some big impacts on voting behavior, on political attitudes. Between the 1930s and 50s, which was a civic era, an era in which political parties were strong, in which people believed in the American political institutions, we saw a almost twofold increase in the number of people who identified themselves as political independents. Went up from the 1930s to the 50s, where it was 25%, to about 40% in the 1970s and 80s. So just in a period of 2 decades, the number of independents almost doubled. A huge increase in the number of split-ticket votes that were cast in 2 elections. The elections we chose to look at, and these are typical, were 1956 and 1972. Both elections in which Republican Party candidates won the presidency by large margins, but in 1956, most people who voted for Ike also voted for Republicans down the ballot. Most people who voted for Adlai Stevenson voted for Democrats down the ballot. In 1972, it was just the opposite. Most people were voting for Richard Nixon, but a lot of people still managed to pull the Democratic lever for lower-level offices. The number of people who identified strongly with a political party fell by almost half. In the 1950s, 4 out of 10 Americans said, "I'm a strong Democrat, I'm a strong Republican." By the 1970s, only 25% felt that way. The number of people who had positive attitudes toward the political parties dropped hugely. In the 1950s, 2/3 of Americans said they could come up with at least one nice thing in surveys that they could say about the Democrats or the Republicans, often both. Even if they thought of themselves as Democrats, they could find something nice to say about the Republicans, and vice versa. By the 1970s, fewer than half of the electorate, and I would imagine the number is even lower now, can say something nice about either of the political parties. So a major political institution that much of the public really disdains. This chart may be a little more difficult to look at, but in the early 1960s, most Americans had a high degree of political efficacy. 2/3 of Americans believed, of American adults believed, that public officials care about what most people think. So a feeling that, they really care what's happening to me. By 2006, only 10% felt the same way. In the early 1960s, about the time Jack Kennedy was president, about 80% said that government was somehow run for the benefit of everybody. By the middle of this decade, only about 1/3 felt the same way. So attitudes toward the political process, toward political institutions, decline in these idealist eras. But this year's realignment is going to be a civic realignment. It's going to be driven by the Millennial generation, the newest of America's civic generations. We've had 4 previous such realignments. One of them technically wasn't one in which an election occurred, would have been the period from 1776 to 1787 when America won its independence from Great Britain and then established the constitutional order. I'd say that was a major civic undertaking, and so even though it didn't involve elections, it certainly involved the creation of the civic infrastructure of the United States. In 1860, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, we saw America's second civic realignment. Not only did it resolve the great moral dilemma that had bothered the country since the establishment of the Constitution, slavery, but it also determined that in the end, central power, centralized national government power, was going to be supreme over state power, state policies. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt led the third civic realignment. It established the notion that the federal government was going to be responsible for trying to maintain as high a degree of economic stability as possible, established the notion that the federal government would be responsible for creating a kind of a floor beneath which America's workers could not fall economically. And finally, 2008, the familiar red state, blue state map we see is going to be changed in this coming election, certainly in 2012, and a lot of movement between these states that we've considered to be traditional red or blue states will occur. Not only will that occur, but as Morley will talk about in a moment, we will see a different constellation and set of policy concerns. So civic realignments result again from the coming of age of a generation like the millennials, like the GI generation of the 1930s and 1940s. They rebel against the divisive personal morality and culture of the previous generation. They aren't concerned with those moral issues, social issues anymore. Instead, they want to revitalize America's civic institutions. They want to make things happen. They want to resolve problems. Civic realignments focus on the resolution of longstanding economic issues. They result in the building of governmental institutions that have been allowed to stagnate to a large extent over the preceding 4 decades. And they also, as we will expect, as we predicted, and as we've seen in the elections this year, in more positive attitudes toward the political process, toward the participation of the individual voters in the political process. And it will cause more people to identify strongly as members of one or the other of the political parties. It will be driven by the millennial generation, and this is the generation that's going to shape the coming civic realignment. And we have these 2 national news magazine covers. The first one on the left, is a kind of a depiction of the previous Generation X. And it really does, it was from the middle of 1990, and it really does tell you how people viewed the young of that era, wearing black, none of them looking at one another, all sort of dissociated with one another. Teenagers by the middle of 2000, however, seemed to be much more clean-cut. They were upbeat. They were all clustered together. They were ethnically and racially diverse, which is a huge key element of this young civic millennial generation. And it is going to have a major impact in politics. We believe that it will benefit the Democrats, at least to this point. That seems to be the direction. This chart looks at what party identification among young Americans has been like over the past 6 or 8 years. 2002, among young Americans, a slight plurality, 39% to 37%. Actually, this was the last of the Generation X. Virtually all of these people were in Generation X, actually identified as Republicans over Democrats. By 2004, the first millennials were coming into the electorate, and the Democrats made gains, and the Democrats had a slight plurality. Kind of an interesting fact about the 2004 election, the only two generational types that gave John Kerry a majority of their votes were at the very elderly extreme, the last remaining 80-year-old plus GIs, and the millennials, the very first millennials who were eligible to vote in 2004. Last year, among millennials, the Democrats held the majority of party identifiers by about a 52 to 30 margin over the Republicans, and if the current trends continue, it will end up being about a 2-to-1 margin by 2010. Not only that, but this is the first generation in at least 4 decades in which most members of the generation actually think of themselves as liberals rather than conservatives. Looking at the left-hand set of bars, that represents baby boomers. Among baby boomers, conservatives outnumber liberals and progressives by a 29% to 22% margin. Among Gen Xers, it's a little closer, 26 to 21, but still more conservatives. But among millennials, liberals and progressives actually outnumber the conservatives by a 29 to 16-point margin, or about a 2-to-1 margin. So things look like they're moving in the direction of the Democrats, and Morley will talk to you about what that means at this moment for American public policy.
Thank you, Mike. So you already recognize the impact of the millennial generation in the makeup of the United States Senate. The two candidates on either side of this picture were elected in 2006. Their elections owed their elections to the introduction of a new social network site called YouTube, and the candidates' ability to capture faux pas by their opponents, which became more popular and more watched than any television commercial anybody put together. But what people haven't noticed is it was the millennial voter turnout in the college towns of Virginia and Montana that provided the winning margins for Senator Webb and now Senator Tester. And of course, in between, you have Senator Claire McCaskill, who didn't quite have her YouTube moment against her opponent, but was in the bellwether state of Missouri, which is why we always focus there, the candidate who won against a Republican candidate whose avowed campaign message was God, gays, and guns. And as their campaign manager said, Claire McCaskill's on the wrong side of all three of those issues. Well, maybe, but she was the victor. And she was the victor because she was running in 2006 with millennial support and not in 2000 and 2002 and having to depend upon Gen X voters. Here's some of the things that millennials think about are different as a framework for the public policy challenge that both Simon and Peter talked about. How do we create a true policy agenda for the 21st century that's as bold as the speaker that preceded us on the energy side? How do we do that in all aspects of American politics? This generation has the most gender-neutral attitudes in history. They were raised by their parents with a commonality of assignment and role and expectation. For women, just the same as men. Young women's sports, obviously as popular and as participative as those for boys. So when you ask the question, as we did in our survey research for the book, should women return to their traditional roles in society, 40% of the older generations completely disagree, 50% of boomers and Gen Xers. Among millennials, it's 60%, and the numbers there on the millennial side are pretty much the same for both men and women. Majorities of millennials believe that homosexuality is an acceptable lifestyle and favor gay marriage. Here's the actual numbers on that. Among older generations, only 33% support for gay marriage. Among the millennials we interviewed, 61%. So as you begin to go through this roster of social issues that the Republicans were sure would win the state of Missouri and therefore the nation, you can see that they don't have the power to divide and conquer among millennials as they have in previous generations. One of the reasons is that this is the most ethnically diverse generation in American history. 40% of them are of African American, Hispanic, Asian, or mixed race background, and 20% of them have an immigrant parent in their family. And their attitudes on racial issues, the other great social issue divide that has bedeviled our policy attempts to unite the country, also reflect this same level of diversity. Among millennials, 82% support affirmative action. In our surveys of last year, the older generations we asked, only 68% did. And if you go back to 1987, support for affirmative action amongst all the existing generations at that time was only 58%. When asked to agree or disagree with the statement, I don't have much in common with people of other races, white Gen Xers in 1987 at that age group said 24% completely disagreed. White millennials, almost half of them completely disagree with this statement. If you add in somewhat disagree, it's almost a unanimous opinion. They are also, because of their own immigrant backgrounds in many cases and/or their attitudes to their friends, peers, and colleagues on MySpace and Facebook who they speak to every day, have a very inclusive attitude towards the question of immigration and how it should be resolved. A majority of millennials oppose a fence along the Mexican border, whereas that is not true of a majority of other generations. But let's turn now, having sort of skipped through the social issues and told you can sort of forget about those. Those are not going to be the way people win campaigns. They weren't the way people won campaigns for Congress in '06. They're going to be even less important in '08. And as millennials, only about 35% of which are currently in the American electorate because of their age, as they move into the American electorate over the next 8 years, by 2020, every single one of them will be part of the American electorate. You're going to see all those kinds of issues fade to the background as quickly as Prohibition was repealed after FDR was elected in 1932, and that divisive social issue disappeared from the political agenda, forever we hope. So, here's what they do care about. They really are in favor of the expansion of federal government to deal with societal and economic concerns. Healthcare, education, and economic inequality obviously come to mind relatively quickly. There's this great public debate throughout American history, almost from the beginning of America's history, on a couple of fundamental questions. To what degree should individual liberty need to be sacrificed for the needs of the community, which was the great fight amongst the Pilgrims, actually, as they tried to figure things out? And to what degree do we need to establish some kind of national order and regulatory and regulated activity versus allowing local flexibility at the state or local level? And that, of course, was the great compromise and solutions of our Constitution that tried to deal with that. Well, as we move through American history, these kinds of policy debates continue to arise, and in civic eras, the era we're about to enter into, they become particularly poignant and important. So if you can think about, the great Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, Lincoln was arguing that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that there had to be some fundamental moral principles that governed all of the country, not a section of the country. And his opponent, the Democrat Stephen Douglas, argued for popular sovereignty. He was basically saying, hey, let's leave it all up to the states. Whatever they do, it's just not a concern that needs to be discussed at the national level. And so that kind of question and that fulcrum of debate was resolved in the civic realignment of 1860, dramatically in favor of the notion that there are some fundamental things that the national government needs to define for the country, that the entire country needs to believe and agree upon. And in 1932, you had a very similar debate. This time in the economic arena, you had the Republicans arguing for laissez-faire economic approaches. President Coolidge's great phrase, the business of America is business, and the government ought to stay out of it. Those are the kinds of attitudes that say individual liberty, particularly in the economic sphere, is more important, is the fundamental important priority, and federal intrusion is wrong. Well, of course, they lost with Herbert Hoover dramatically to FDR, who instituted the notion that economic equality, economic justice, some kind of economic fairness needs to be part of the American scheme of things with the New Deal. And that's the kind of debate you're going to be seeing here as we go forward this year. One of the things that civic generations do is they dramatically change, and they care about the issue of economic inequality, and they dramatically change the nature of that distribution of wealth in America. So in 1929, the 50% of America's wealth was held by the 1% of richest Americans. After the economic policies of the New Deal were put in place by 1949, only 30% of America's wealth was held by the top 1% of Americans, as economic inequality shrunk dramatically. Now, the particular remedies, you don't necessarily want a Great Depression to solve that problem. The high tax rates, as we would suggest today, that help bring this about, may not be the policies for the new era. The policies are not, generations are cyclical, but the actual policies they enact have to take into account the realities of the day in which they're enacted. But nevertheless, the notion that by 2001, 40% of America's wealth was held by the wealthiest 1%, and that number continues to grow, right up until the notion of subprime mortgages and the end of ability of private equity firms leverage buyouts generating these billion-dollar payouts. Suddenly this year we're beginning to see that kind of wealth at the top end disappear. And it's probably just the beginning and another sign of this kind of civic era. So if you ask, for instance, people whether government should take care of people who can't take care of themselves, 73% of millennials agree with that statement. Last year when we asked them, only 68%, which is still a large number, of older generations certainly agreed with it. Sets the stage for this kind of thing. By comparison, we have some 1994 numbers up there where the time was not right for that kind of government intervention. I would prefer a bigger government that provided more services. Only 30% of the population agreed in 1994. Older generations last year, still there was no majority for it. Look at the number for millennials on I would prefer a bigger government that provided more service. Almost 70% of millennials agree with that statement. In fact, 51% of millennials believe that government does benefit all, whereas only 36% of older generations agree with that statement. And in another dramatic generational difference in attitudes towards government, 64% of millennials disagree that the federal government is wasteful, whereas 58% of the rest of the population agree. So it's a complete reversal on those kinds of questions. People saying that Democrats are for big government and big programs and big spending in 2008 will meet an electorate who says, and? Government should therefore guarantee health insurance for all citizens if this requires raising taxes. Millennials are slightly more in favor of this even than older generations, but you can see that health care will be a debate that pretty much gets resolved in the next 4 or 5 years. America will adopt some form of national health insurance because the population and the public is ready to do so. Millennials are a very volunteer-oriented generation. They love to serve their nation and their community. In 1984, 27% of Gen X attendees at high schools had done some kind of community service. By 2004, when all high schoolers were millennials, 80% had done some kind of volunteer service. In fact, the volunteer corps, the 3 corps of the federal government, which offer volunteer service at a national coordinated level, among 16 to 24-year-olds in 1989, they represented only 13% of the people who stepped forward and participated in those programs. By 2006, when they were all millennials instead, you had a doubling of the size of the young people involved in volunteerism. Volunteerism will end up being a cause that can be organized and demanded as we go forward into the next era. So if you take a look at the calls for national citizen service and in exchange for help with higher education, you will find that the millennials think that's just a wonderful idea. It actually generates some of the largest applause lines on the campaign trail this year. We won't spend a lot of time on the environment and foreign policy sides, because you've heard already and you will hear more of that today, but here's the quick slides on their attitudes. Even at the cost of higher prices, millennials will favor environmental protection, a very green generation. They are an internationally activist type. They do believe the Iraqi war hurt the fight against terrorism. 59% of millennials believe that, but they are more favorable towards building international ties, the kinds of things that our first speakers were talking about, than older generations, much more interested in multilateral solutions. So in conclusion, let me just say that we're about to have in the American electorate a generation that is more optimistic than older generations, that this election will change the U.S. for the better. 39% of millennials, the gray bar in that chart, say that things will be better than they are now after the 2008 election, whereas Gen Xers and baby boomers are not quite so optimistic that this is all going to happen. What is going to happen is that that optimism is going to infect the body politic of America. You're going to see a can-do attitude where values of family and responsibility and diversity, sort of like the gathering at the beginning of the movie The Lion King, where everybody comes to Pride Rock and the king presents the new generation that's going to rule the world safely in an all-inclusive, peaceful way, where that scene takes place. That's exactly what's going to happen in 2008, and the new generation will make it happen. Thank you all very much for listening.